In October 1983, Bethlehem Steel ended steelmaking just south of Buffalo, and about 7,300 paychecks disappeared from a city of barely 22,000 people. 80 years earlier, Buffalo was spoken of as the richest city per capita in America, lit by Niagara and crowded with grain, lake steamers, and mansions. The silence did not begin at the mill. It began with the place itself, and with the routes that once made it unavoidable. At the eastern end of Lake Erie, the water gathers itself before it leaves. It does not look dramatic at first. There is no mountain pass, no canyon wall, no single gate wide enough to announce the fate of a city. There is only the lake, broad and cold, pressed by wind from the west. There is the mouth of the Buffalo River, low and working, brown with silt, edged by timber, stone, rope, and later by iron. A few miles north, the Niagara River begins its run toward the falls. Behind the lake lies the interior of the continent. Ahead of it lies the old Atlantic world. Buffalo grew in that seam. Before it was a city of mansions, mills, rail yards, and electric towers. It was a place where movement had to change form. The lake could carry wheat, corn, lumber, salt, barreled pork, and passengers across the inland seas, but the lake could not carry them to Manhattan. The river could pull water north toward Niagara, but it could not politely turn east. Roads existed, but roads were slow, soft, and expensive. A wagon could groan under a load for days and still move only a small part of what a boat could carry in silence. So the cargo stopped. That stop was Buffalo's first business. The city's early wealth did not come from gold in the ground or cotton in the field. It came from interruption. A farmer's harvest from Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, or farther west could arrive by lake vessel and meet a different America at Buffalo's docks. There, grain and lumber left one world of movement and entered another. Men with sore backs and wet boots pulled, lifted, rolled, weighed, sorted, and loaded. Horses strained against harness. Mules waited along towpaths. Sailors stepped from decks onto planks slick with river mud. The air carried the smell of wet grain, lake fish, horse sweat, coal smoke, and fresh-cut wood. For a city, this was better than scenery. It was leverage. The Erie Canal made the leverage national. Built across New York between 1817 and 1825, the canal ran from Albany to Buffalo, a narrow artificial river cut through forests, farms, limestone ridges, and old indigenous homelands. It gave the Great Lakes a water route to the Hudson River, and through the Hudson to New York Harbor. At its western end, Buffalo became not just a lakeside town, but the last inland hand reaching toward the Atlantic. There had been arguments about that ending. Nearby, Black Rock wanted the canal terminus. It had a natural harbor on the Niagara River, and men who believed geography had chosen them. Buffalo had to be improved, dredged, protected, and argued into usefulness. But the final decision went to Buffalo, and the decision mattered more than almost any building that would follow. A place that had been burned during the War of 1812 became, within a generation, one of the country's necessary addresses. The canal changed the meaning of distance. Before it, moving a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City could cost about $100, enough money to make distance feel like a locked door. After the canal opened, that same ton could move for about $10, and the door opened with a wooden creak. The reduction was not an abstraction. It meant flour on tables in eastern cities. It meant Western farms no longer ended at the horizon. It meant New York City could pull the interior of the continent toward its harbor, one canal boat at a time. And it meant Buffalo became a threshold. The commercial slip, where the Erie Canal met the Buffalo River, was not merely a piece of infrastructure. It was a sentence written in water. Here the inland continent changes direction. Canal boats came and went in lines, low in the water, their cargoes packed tight beneath canvas. Lake vessels waited for unloading. Warehouses rose close to the water so that goods did not have to travel far before being handled again. Streets near the harbor filled with the small businesses of a transfer city. Forwarding agents, taverns, stables, chandlers, boarding houses, repair shops, mills, banks. The city learned to make money from friction. Every barrel that had to be rolled, every bushel that had to be weighed, every plank that had to be stacked, every passenger who needed a meal, a bed, a ticket, or a roomer left something behind. Not much at first. A coin, a fee, a night's wages, a signature in a ledger. But repeated thousands of times, then tens of thousands, the small residue of movement became brick blocks, church steeples, paved streets, and office windows looking down toward the harbor. Buffalo's rise was not graceful. It was loud, muddy, muscular, and seasonal. The lake froze. Spring thaws could turn streets into ruts. Fires visited waterfront districts as they did in many 19th century cities built of wood, coal, oil, and impatience. Cholera and other diseases moved along trade routes with passengers and cargo. But the city had what growing places needed most: a reason for strangers to keep arriving. If you had stood near the harbor in the middle of the 19th century, you would not have seen decline waiting in the distance. You would have seen motion organized into profit: masts and smokestacks, sacks and barrels, mules and tugboats, men calling out over water, the slap of lines against pilings, the slow arrival of the West in edible form. The city was becoming a machine for receiving America. By 1900, that machine had swollen into one of the great urban concentrations of the United States. Buffalo held more than 350,000 people, enough human life to make the streets feel like a tide of their own. It ranked as the 8th largest city in the country, and its harbor was counted among the busiest water ports in the world. Those numbers are worth seeing physically. Blocks of workers' houses spreading outward from the river, grain, coal, and lumber moving in volumes no hand could imagine alone. Ships lined along the water as if the lake had grown a second shore made of hulls. A person arriving by boat or train would not have mistaken Buffalo for a provincial town. It was a city with shoulders. It had the confidence of a place that knew why it existed. The map itself seemed to approve. Lake Erie behind it, the canal before it, the Niagara frontier beside it. Railroads beginning to braid themselves into the same old logic of transfer. Yet hidden inside that strength was a condition. Buffalo needed America to stop. Its prosperity depended on the pause between systems, on the fact that cargo could not yet glide from the Farm Belt to the Atlantic without changing hands, boats, ledgers, and labor. The city grew around that pause until the pause looked permanent. It built streets, fortunes, habits, and ambitions, on the belief that the route through Buffalo was not merely useful, but natural. For a long time it was. Then the machinery of stopping became more powerful than the stop itself. Before Buffalo taught grain to rise, grain moved like a burden. It came east in sacks, barrels, bins, and loose heaps, harvested from fields that were getting farther from the Atlantic every season. Ohio wheat, Michigan wheat, Indiana wheat. Later, grain from the prairie country beyond them. It arrived at Buffalo in the bellies of lake vessels, where it sat in darkness under deck beams, smelling of dust, damp wood, and the long inland passage. To move it again, men went down into the hold. They did not move history. They moved weight. A sack had to be filled, lifted, carried, dragged, hoisted, emptied, and counted. The work was intimate and exhausting. Grain got into cuffs, collars, hair, and lungs. The hold of a vessel could be close and hot, even when the lake wind outside was cold. Blocks and tackle helped, but they did not change the basic fact. Human bodies were still the narrow place through which the harvest had to pass. Buffalo's harbor was growing too large for that kind of movement. The Erie Canal had made the city necessary, but necessity created congestion. Lake boats waited. Canal boats waited. Merchants waited for invoices. Captains waited for crews. And cargo waited, because a man with two hands could only lift so much before his back began to tremble. The city's advantage, the place where America had to stop, threatened to become its weakness. Too much grain could turn the harbor into a clogged throat. Joseph Dart saw the problem from inside the trade. He was not a romantic figure standing outside the machinery of commerce. He was a Buffalo merchant, a man of ledgers, warehouses, timing, and spoilage. He understood that grain was valuable only if it kept moving, and that the old method was too slow for the volume beginning to arrive from the inland farms. With Robert Dunbar, a mechanical engineer who had come to Buffalo from Scotland by way of Canada, Dart adapted an older milling idea to the waterfront. The result was a wooden building with a strange new purpose. It did not merely shelter grain, it lifted it. Built in the early 1840s, Dart's elevator used steam power, belts, buckets, and gravity to do what gangs of men had done by muscle. A long mechanical leg could be lowered into the hold of a vessel. Along that leg, small cups moved in a continuous loop. They bit into the loose grain, rose in sequence, and carried the kernels upward into the building. At the top, the grain poured out, was weighed, and dropped into storage bins. From there, chutes and conveyors could send it into canal boats, rail cars, or another part of the warehouse. The word elevator was literal before it became ordinary. The grain went up so that it could come down where men wanted it. That change remade Buffalo's waterfront. A vessel that once required long, punishing labor could be emptied with a speed that felt almost indecent to older eyes. The cargo did not have to be packed into sacks before it could be handled. It could move in bulk, as a mass, as a commodity measured by bushels rather than by shoulders. The city no longer merely received grain, it processed movement itself. There is a kind of cold beauty in that. The machine did not care whose farm had grown the wheat. It did not know the weather that had bent the stalks, the debts carried by the farmer, the child who had watched the harvest wagon leave the field. By the time the grain reached Buffalo, it had entered another order. It was weighed, graded, stored, blended, sold, insured, and shipped. The elevator made that order visible. It turned agriculture into architecture. At first, the elevators were wood, tall and practical, standing along the Buffalo River and harbor like oversized barns that had wandered into an industrial city. But the principle was stronger than the material. As the grain trade expanded, the buildings changed. Wood gave way to brick, tile, steel, and then concrete. The forms became heavier, more permanent, less like warehouses, and more like cliffs built by arithmetic. Cylindrical bins rose together in clusters. Conveyor galleries crossed between them high above the ground. Blank walls faced the river without apology. They were not designed to charm anyone. They were designed to hold pressure. Inside them, grain behaved almost like a liquid and almost like stone. It flowed, but it also pressed outward with immense force. It could spoil if wet, heat if mishandled, burn if dust met flame. The elevator had to be strong, dry, organized, and ruthless. Every wall, bin, belt, chute, and scale answered a practical demand. Nothing in the building needed a decorative excuse. Decades later, architects in Europe would look at photographs of American grain elevators and see a new language. Some had never stood beside the Buffalo River, never smelled wet grain under a gray lake sky, never heard the machinery knocking inside the bins. But they saw the forms, cylinders, slabs, straight lines, masses without ornament. To them, these working structures looked like the future of architecture. To Buffalo, they were business. That gap is part of the city's story. The buildings that European modernists admired as pure form were, on the ground, dirty, dangerous, noisy places. Men still worked there, ships still nudged into docks, grain dust still settled on boots and window ledges. The river still carried an industrial film. Beauty, if it existed, came as a byproduct of usefulness, and usefulness was never gentle. Yet the elevators helped make Buffalo more than a canal terminus. They made it a command point in the grain economy of the continent. The wheat fields of the interior could be gathered, lifted, stored, and redirected through this city with a mechanical efficiency that multiplied its old geographic advantage. Buffalo had not moved on the map. The map had become more valuable because Buffalo had learned how to handle what arrived there. This was the city's second bargain with motion. The first bargain had been simple. Everything must stop here. The second was more powerful. Everything that stops here can be made to move faster than before. For a while, the two bargains worked together. Lake vessels came in heavy with grain. Elevators swallowed their cargo. Canal boats and rail cars carried it east. Money passed through offices. Men found wages along the water. The skyline near the river grew not from church spires or civic monuments, but from storage bins large enough to hold the harvest of places most Buffalo residents would never see. The city's wealth was no longer only in the pause. It was in the machinery that shortened the pause. And there was the first quiet contradiction. Buffalo prospered by making the stop more efficient. Every improvement strengthened the city, but every improvement also taught commerce to hate delay. The elevator was a triumph because it reduced waiting. It made friction profitable by removing part of the friction. Along the Buffalo River, grain climbed into the air, and the city grew richer beneath it. But a country that learned to move grain this way would not stop looking for faster routes. Buffalo did not own Niagara Falls, but it lived close enough to borrow its thunder. The falls were not in the city. They stood north of it, where the Niagara River made its violent descent between two countries, throwing mist into the air and shaking the ground with a sound older than any canal, elevator, railroad, or factory. For generations, visitors went there to look at power in its wild form. They stood at railings, in spray, in the damp smell of stone and river, watching water fall with no visible exhaustion. Buffalo looked at the same water and saw distance collapsing again. The Erie Canal had made the city rich by joining lake water to Atlantic commerce. Now Niagara promised a different joining, falling water to electric current, current to wire, wire to factory, street lamp, trolley, hotel lobby, exposition hall. The old city of transfer wanted to become a city of transmission. In the 1890s, this was not yet ordinary. Electricity still belonged partly to demonstration, partly to danger, partly to wonder. Wires were appearing above streets in American cities, but many people still measured night by flame. Gaslight, kerosene, candles, coal fires, the dim orange glow of furnaces and lamps. Electric light had a different authority. It did not flicker like a wick. It arrived with a clean insistence, a white confidence that made older forms of illumination look tired. When alternating current from Niagara reached Buffalo in 1896, the city could claim a place near the front edge of the electrical age. The power had traveled more than a local distance. It had crossed the space between a cataract and a city, carried by a system associated with Nikola Tesla, George Westinghouse, and the great argument over whether electricity could be sent far enough to matter. Buffalo did not need to explain the theory to feel the result. Machines could turn. Streets could brighten. A city already built on movement could now advertise itself as modern motion made visible. The timing could hardly have been better for civic pride. By the opening years of the 20th century, Buffalo had grown into a city large enough to expect attention. Railroads entered it. Lake steamers served it. Grain elevators stood along its river. Money had climbed from the waterfront into banks, clubs, office buildings, and houses with deep lawns. The city was close to Canada, close to the lakes, close to Niagara, and confident enough to host a World's Fair. The Pan American Exposition opened in Buffalo in 1901 on the northern edge of the city, spread across hundreds of acres near Delaware Park. It was built to celebrate the countries of the Western Hemisphere, but it also celebrated Buffalo's image of itself. The grounds became a temporary city of towers, courts, lagoons, bridges, fountains, sculpture, color, and electric light. The buildings were not meant to last. Many were made of wood, plaster, and decorative surfaces that could dazzle from a distance and vanish after the season ended. They belong to the logic of exposition. Make the future visible, then dismantle it. The fair was called the Rainbow City. That name mattered. Chicago's Great Fair of 1893 had been remembered as the White City, gleaming and classical. Buffalo offered color and electricity. Its buildings carried Spanish and Latin American flourishes, painted in tones that shifted through the grounds like a theatrical set. At night, Niagara's power helped transform the whole place. Lamps traced cornices, domes, towers, bridges, and pools. Reflections trembled in the water. Visitors moved through a city that seemed less built than switched on. At the center rose the electric tower. It was the kind of structure an era builds when it wants to be believed. High above the fairgrounds, its lights arranged architecture into spectacle. Below it, water cascaded in controlled display, the ancient force of Niagara reduced to ornament and power supply at once. The tower did not have to be useful in the old Buffalo sense. It did not load grain or transfer cargo or pour steel. It performed confidence. It told visitors that the city beside Lake Erie was not merely a place where freight changed hands. It was a place where the future could be staged. The exhibits inside the fairgrounds carried that same confidence. There were machines, inventions, industrial displays, cultural pavilions, agricultural exhibits, and entertainments. The modern world had come to Buffalo not as a slow explanation, but as a crowd. People arrived by trolley, train, carriage, and foot. They bought tickets, walked beneath arches, ate, stared, listened, and carried home the memory of a city lit by falling water from miles away. Yet the fair's most famous fact would not be its light. On September 6, 1901, President William McKinley entered the Temple of Music for a public reception. The building had the cheerful impermanence of the exposition around it, a place designed for ceremony and sound. A line of visitors waited to shake the president's hand. Among them was Leon Czolgosz, whose right hand was wrapped in a bandage that concealed a revolver. When McKinley reached him, the shots were fired at close range. The details belong to a different register of history. The crowded room, the stunned movement of bodies. The president carried to the exposition hospital. The surgical room not properly equipped for what had happened inside the great fair of modern technology. Doctors searched for one bullet and could not find it. An X-ray machine was available, but it was not used. In a city displaying the future stood nearby and remained uncertain. McKinley died 8 days later in Buffalo. Theodore Roosevelt, summoned from the Adirondacks, took the oath of office in the home of Ansley Wilcox on Delaware Avenue. The transfer of presidential power happened quietly in a private house, away from the fairgrounds and the dying brightness of the exposition season. Outside, Buffalo was still Buffalo. Streetcars, newspapers, hotels, lake wind, electric lamps, crowds discussing what had happened in rooms they had not entered. The Pan American Exposition closed that November. Its temporary buildings came down. The electric tower, built to announce a new age, disappeared from the skyline. The fair left behind photographs, souvenirs, newspaper pages, a surviving building, and a wound in national memory. It had shown Buffalo at the height of its self-belief, and it had also shown how thin the wall could be between spectacle and fragility. For the city, Niagara's light did not fade all at once. Electricity remained part of Buffalo's claim on modern life. Power helped industry expand. Trolleys moved through the streets. Offices, theaters, hotels, and homes took on the glow of a place that had seen night altered before many others did. But light can flatter a city. It can make plaster look like stone. It can turn temporary towers into monuments. It can draw the eye away from the machinery that holds everything up. Buffalo had been illuminated by Niagara, and for a season it looked like the future had chosen the city personally. The deeper question was whether the future would need Buffalo as much as Buffalo needed the future. Money in Buffalo first arrived wet. It came through the harbor, over planks, in the dust of grain, in the scrape of barrels, in the ledgers of canal men and lake merchants. It came in lumber, coal, flour, livestock, shipping fees, storage charges, railroad contracts, banking commissions, insurance papers, and the 1,000 small payments that a transfer city collected from a moving continent. At the waterfront, money was noisy. It shouted, rang, groaned, and coughed through steam. Then it walked north and became quiet. On Delaware Avenue, the wealth of Buffalo changed clothes. It left behind the mud of the docks and appeared as limestone, brick, oak staircases, polished brass, carriage houses, conservatories, and deep lawns set back from the street. The avenue ran through the city with the composure of a place that had learned to display power without raising its voice. Behind iron fences and rows of trees, houses stood with their shoulders squared, each one announcing that Buffalo's prosperity had become domestic enough to sleep indoors. This was not the wealth of one industry alone. That was part of its confidence. The money along Delaware Avenue came from shipping and grain, from railroads and banking, from lumber, newspapers, manufacturing, and the businesses that grew around all of them. Buffalo's fortunes were braided. A man might begin with one form of movement and end with another. A family might own land, finance trade, sit on a board, invest in elevators, lend to manufacturers, and entertain under chandeliers whose light came from the same modern city that had made the money possible. In the 1880s and 1890s, Delaware Avenue became known as Millionaire's Row. Later memory would say that Buffalo had 60 millionaires around the time of the Pan American Exposition, more per person than any other American city. The exact claim is difficult to hold in the hand, but the buildings do not need the statistic to make the point. Enough money gathered there to summon architects who also worked for names like Vanderbilt and Astor. Enough money gathered there to make a city on Lake Erie imitate, in stone and shade, the habits of older Eastern wealth. The houses were not all alike. Some wore Roman arches and heavy roofs. Some borrowed from the English country house. Some stood in brick with pale trim, others in stone with deep porches and carved entrances. There were bay windows looking toward the street, porte-cochers for carriages, servants' quarters, libraries, dining rooms long enough to make meals feel ceremonial. In winter, smoke rose from chimneys above snow-packed lawns. In summer, the trees softened the facades until the avenue seemed less like a street than a procession. The city's money also built upward. Downtown, the Ellicott Square building opened in 1896, occupying an entire block with the ambition of a city that did not think small. Designed by Daniel Burnham's firm with Charles Atwood. It was considered the largest office building in the world when it was completed. Its scale belonged to commerce, but its interior carried the manners of wealth. The glass-covered court drew daylight down into the building. Offices and shops opened inward around a public room where business could feel almost civic. A person walking across the floor passed through a chamber made for contracts, rent, lawyers, merchants, and confidence. Nearby, the Guarantee Building rose with a different kind of authority. Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler gave Buffalo one of the early masterpieces of the American skyscraper. Its steel frame allowed the building to climb, but Sullivan wrapped that vertical structure in terracotta ornament that seemed almost organic, as if leaves, vines, and flame had been pressed into the skin of modern finance. Here was another Buffalo contradiction, a city of grain dust and lake mud commissioning architecture that belonged in the first rank of American design. Architecture followed the money because the money was real. The Larkin Company, a soap and mail order business, produced one of Buffalo's most important clients, Darwin D. Martin. A self-made executive, Martin brought Frank Lloyd Wright to Buffalo at a time when Wright's reputation was still largely tied to the Midwest. Between 1903 and 1905, Wright designed Martin's house on Jewett Parkway. It was not on Delaware Avenue, and it did not behave like a Delaware Avenue mansion. It stretched horizontally, with broad eaves, art glass, connected buildings, and spaces that opened into one another. It seemed less interested in European memory than in a new American way of living. Still, it belonged to the same city of accumulated wealth. The Martin house took industrial money and turned it into an experiment. Its rooms were not just rooms. They were part of a total design: house, furniture, glass, landscape, light. Wealth here did not dress itself as aristocracy. It hired a young architect to reorganize domestic life. That, too, was Buffalo at its height. The city had enough money not only to imitate the old symbols of status, but to gamble on new ones. Yet houses remember differently than ledgers. A ledger can be closed. A business can fail, merge, move, or vanish. A route can shift. A harbor can lose traffic. A factory can shut its gates. But a mansion remains in place, facing the street long after the fortune that built it has scattered into inheritances, debts, foundations, museums, offices, and sales records. The stone does not explain, it simply stays. That is why Delaware Avenue carries a strange double meaning. It is proof that Buffalo was once rich enough to build with permanence, and proof that permanence can outlive the conditions that produced it. Some mansions were demolished. Some became clubs, schools, offices, charities, or divided interiors. Rooms built for one family learned to hold committees, tenants, patients, receptions, storage boxes, or silence. The city did not erase its wealth all at once. It repurposed it, room by room. The transformation had not yet become decline in the years when these buildings were new. No one walking beneath the trees of Delaware Avenue in 1901 had to imagine empty lots on the east side, abandoned industrial land near the lake, or grain elevators admired more as ruins than as machines. The city seemed too solid for that. Its best buildings told the same story in different materials. Buffalo was not a frontier town anymore. It was a capital of movement, storage, power, and money. But there was a warning hidden in the beauty. The mansions were fixed. The money that built them was not. It had come from routes, exchanges, markets, technologies, and advantages that could be altered by decisions made far from Delaware Avenue. A house could hold mahogany, marble, and stained glass in perfect order, but it could not force grain to keep coming through the old harbor. It could not make a railroad tariff favorable. It could not prevent a new canal, a new seaway, a new highway, or a new industrial geography from changing the value of the place outside its windows. Buffalo's wealth had finally become architecture, and architecture, for all its weight, could not move when the roots began to move. South of Buffalo, the city changed temperature. The lake was still there, wide and gray, taking the weather into itself. The same water that had carried grain and passengers to Buffalo's harbor now touched another kind of shore. Here the air thickened. It smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, oil, wet ash, and the sour mineral breath of furnaces. The ground felt less like land than an extension of the mill. Slag, rail, brick, cinder puddles with a sheen on them, and roads built not for strolling but for hauling weight. This was Lackawanna. It began as a choice made by men looking at a map of costs. The Lackawanna Iron and Steel Company had grown in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in coal country, where its name belonged to valley, railroad, furnace, and family. But by the end of the 19th century, the old location had become less convenient. Iron ore was moving across the Great Lakes from the upper Midwest. Rail connections mattered. Lakefront mattered. Scale mattered. A steel company that wanted to compete needed room, water, tracks, and a way to bring raw materials to the furnace with fewer delays. Buffalo's southern edge offered all of that. In 1899, the company began acquiring land along the Lake Erie shore in what was then West Seneca. The purchases were quiet enough that some landowners thought the property might be connected to the Pan American Exposition. It was not. The future being planned here would not be painted in bright exposition colors or outlined in electric bulbs. It would be black, red, and gray. It would run day and night. It would ask the lake to become an industrial servant. Construction began in 1900. Equipment came from Scranton. A ship canal was dredged. Miles of track were laid so the works could receive ore, coal, coke, and men. The plant was not added to the landscape so much as imposed upon it. It required its own harbor, its own rail logic, its own housing problem, its own weather. A blast furnace does not fit politely into a town. A town learns to form around it. By late 1902, the first shipment of iron ore had arrived. In early 1903, the first steel was made. 6,000 workers were already attached to the plant, thousands of them coming from Scranton with the company, following the machinery west, as if the old industrial valley had been loosened and dragged to the shore of Lake Erie. The movement repeated Buffalo's older story in a harder material. Once again, the city's region profited because things had to meet there. Ore came by water. Fuel and labor came by rail. Power, capital, land, and markets converged beside the lake, but grain could be lifted, stored, and sent away. Steel changed the ground beneath it. It left deeper marks. It needed furnaces, rolling mills, coke ovens, stockpiles, open hearths, cranes, ladles, warehouses, and a workforce large enough to make the plant feel like a city within the city. Lackawanna became that city. In 1909, the area around the mill separated from West Seneca and incorporated as its own municipality. The name carried the company's past from Pennsylvania into New York. Streets filled with workers' houses, stores, churches, taverns, boarding rooms, and families speaking languages brought by work and migration. There were Poles, Italians, Irish, Germans, Hungarians, Slovaks, African Americans from the South, and others drawn by the regular pull of a steel paycheck. The place was not built around leisure. It was built around shifts. The mill governed time. It told men when to wake, when to eat, when to sleep, when to step through the gate, when to lift, pour, shovel, hook, signal, duck, and wait. The whistle carried farther than church bells. Night did not mean quiet. At night the works glowed against the lake, and the sky above Lackawanna could pulse with the furnace light, a red weather made by industry. Snow fell into it and darkened. Rain struck hot surfaces and rose as steam. On some mornings, the lake wind pushed the smell back over Buffalo, a reminder that the city's prosperity had acquired a southern furnace. The work was dangerous, but danger was only one part of its meaning. A steel plant gave men something the older transfer economy had not always promised. Wages that could support a household, a mortgage, a grocery account, a parish school, a union hall, a corner bar, a daughter's dress, a son's first car. The paycheck was not abstract prosperity. It was meat wrapped in paper from the butcher. It was coal delivered before winter. It was a kitchen table bought on installments. It was a row house with soot on the windows and children on the steps. In 1922, Bethlehem Steel acquired Lackawanna Steel. The new owner was already one of the great names in American steel, and the plant south of Buffalo became part of a larger industrial empire. Bethlehem spent heavily in the 1920s to modernize the works. The site expanded in function and meaning. It was no longer merely a regional mill. It became one of the central engines of Western New York's 20th century economy. The scale is difficult to see unless it is put against the body. At its wartime and post-war height, the Lackawanna Works employed roughly 20,000 people, enough workers to empty whole neighborhoods at shift change and fill roads, streetcars, lunch counters, and union meetings. Its site covered about 1,300 acres, a piece of industrial ground so large that a man could spend his working life inside its boundaries and still know only one part of it well. The plant made steel for a country that was building bridges, factories, ships, rail lines, office towers, machines, and war materiel. Buffalo had once made itself unavoidable by handling what passed through. Now its region had become unavoidable by making what the country needed to stand. Steel gave Western New York a new kind of confidence. It was less elegant than the confidence of Delaware Avenue and less theatrical than the light of the Pan American Exposition. But it was more durable in the imagination of working families. Grain money could become mansions. Electric pride could become photographs. Steel money became weekly life. And that made the dependency harder to see. A city can understand that a World's Fair is temporary. It can understand that exposition buildings are made to come down. But a steel plant does not look temporary when its furnaces burn through winter, when its stacks define the horizon, when its gates swallow fathers and sons for generations. It looks permanent, because everything about it is heavy. Lackawanna stood at the edge of the lake as if weight itself had chosen a home. But the same lake that brought ore to the furnaces had taught Buffalo an older truth. Routes could shift, costs could change. A place that seemed necessary could become expensive. A machine built for scale could become too large to turn. For the moment, the furnaces were still speaking. The city listened to them as if they were the sound of the future made solid. Buffalo did not lose its place on the map. The lake still touched it. The river still bent through it. The grain elevators still stood along the Buffalo River with their blind concrete faces turned toward the water. Rail lines still entered the city. The harbor still had slips, warehouses, cranes, tugs, and men who understood the old choreography of cargo. Nothing about the shoreline disappeared in a single season. What changed was the reason to stop there. For more than a century, Buffalo had prospered from a simple fact of geography and engineering. Ships could cross the Great Lakes, but the movement of goods toward the Atlantic required transfer, handling, storage, paperwork, labor, and delay. Buffalo had built a civilization around that delay. Grain came down from the upper lakes and western farms. It was lifted into elevators, inspected, graded, bought, sold, stored, milled, or moved onward by rail, canal, and smaller vessels. A bushel might pause in Buffalo long enough to become part of the city's payroll. The pause had once seemed like nature, but nature had been altered before. The Erie Canal had been an alteration. The grain elevator had been an alteration. Railroads had been an alteration. Niagara had been an alteration. Buffalo's greatness had always depended on human beings cutting, dredging, lifting, wiring, and redirecting the physical world. The city had not simply benefited from geography. It had benefited from geography improved in its favor. Then the improvements continued without asking Buffalo's permission. The St. Lawrence Seaway was not built as an attack on Buffalo. It was built with a larger dream in mind, to open the Great Lakes more directly to ocean commerce, to let larger vessels move between the Atlantic and the industrial heart of North America, to make Montreal, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the Upper Lakes part of a single marine highway. It was a project of locks, channels, dredging, concrete, treaties, engineering crews, and national ambition. Canada and the United States built it together as if the continent itself were being given a deeper throat. The idea had circulated for decades before it became reality. Men in Buffalo saw it coming. Some warned that the city's old role would be reduced. They did not need prophecy. They needed only to follow the line on the map. If a vessel could move farther inland without unloading at Buffalo, then Buffalo's grain elevators, rail connections, and harbor services would no longer be compulsory. They might still be useful. They might still be available. But usefulness is not the same as necessity. That difference can ruin a city slowly. The Seaway opened in 1959. Its new Montreal to Lake Ontario section joined with the Welland Canal, whose locks carried vessels around Niagara Falls between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Together, the system allowed ships to move between Montreal and Lake Erie and through the broader Great Lakes system toward the Upper Lakes. Cargo that once met a hard break at Buffalo could now continue through locks and channels that made the old stopping point feel optional. For Buffalo, optional was a dangerous word. A grain elevator is not easily moved to follow business. Its bins are not furniture. Its concrete cylinders rise from foundations built for one specific relationship between water, rail, and market. A city can build such things only when it believes the route will hold. Once the route shifts, the building remains with its purpose weakened, too large to ignore and too specialized to adapt. The Corn Exchange understood the change in its own way. Its trading floor had once been a room where the grain business possessed sound. Voices, chalk marks, prices, membership, ladders, boards, hands moving through the air. By the mid-20th century, even before the Seaway fully opened, the old rituals were under pressure from larger firms, private purchasing, telephones, changing milling patterns, and new routes. The Seaway did not invent the decline. It gave decline a channel. Before 1959, in a good year, more than 200 million bushels of grain could arrive in Buffalo. Afterward, the total did not climb back to half that level. Rail shipments fell with a violence that numbers alone can barely carry. From millions of bushels in the late 1950s to a thin remnant only a few years later. Imagine a river of grain narrowing until the machinery built for floodwater stood waiting for a creek. The elevators were not abandoned all at once. That would have been simpler and less haunting. Instead, they entered a long afterlife of partial use, reduced use, warehouse use, speculative use, no use. One company stayed, another left. A conveyor stopped, a scale was removed, windows broke, pigeons entered. Grass found seams in the industrial ground. The river, once disciplined by traffic, carried reflections of buildings that had become more image than engine. The shift also exposed a deeper weakness. Buffalo had built too much of its identity on being a passage point. Passage points are powerful when routes are fixed. They are vulnerable when routes become flexible. The city had been the hinge between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic. The Seaway moved part of the hinge eastward and northward. Into locks and channels Buffalo did not control. This was not the same as the closing of a factory gate. It did not produce one photograph that could hold the whole wound. No crowd gathered to watch the city's transportation logic end. Ships still appeared on the lakes. Men still worked. Flour was still milled. Steel still burned south of town. Downtown still had offices, banks, hotels, and department stores. A person could live in Buffalo in 1959 and feel continuity underfoot. But the old arithmetic had changed. The city had made itself rich by shortening the pause between lake and ocean. Now the continent had shortened the pause again, and Buffalo was the delay being removed. The same hunger for efficiency that had made Joseph Dart's elevator so powerful had advanced to a larger scale. The grain had learned to climb in Buffalo. Then the ships learned to pass it by. That is the particular cruelty of infrastructure. It can make a place, and it can unmake the reason for a place, without hatred. Buffalo remained at the edge of Lake Erie, still broad-shouldered, still built from stone, brick, steel, and concrete. But the lake in front of it no longer promised the same obedience. Water had found another instruction. The route that once made Buffalo unavoidable had begun to go around it, and a city built around stopping had to face the sound of movement continuing elsewhere. Buffalo had once been arranged for arrival. Its streets led to water, rail yards, markets, factories, churches, taverns, and parks. The old city did not move quickly by modern standards, but it had a dense intelligence. Workers could walk to a plant. Children could cross to a neighbor's porch. Streetcars pulled daily life along steel lines. Shops sat close enough to houses that errands could be folded into ordinary movement. Even the grandest landscapes, the parks and parkways designed under Frederick Law Olmsted's influence, were part of a larger pattern of connection. Olmsted did not imagine Buffalo's parks as isolated green rooms. He imagined a system. The park, later called Delaware Park, was to be the great pastoral space. The parade, later Martin Luther King Jr. Park, would serve another public purpose on the east side. Front Park would look toward the water. The parkways between them were not merely roads with trees beside them. They were long pieces of landscape, built to make travel itself feel like relief. A person could move from one park to another without fully leaving the atmosphere of green space. The city would not simply contain parks, it would be threaded by them. Humboldt Parkway was the most graceful of those threads. It stretched for roughly 2 miles between Delaware Park and the parade, a broad, tree-lined corridor with a wide central median where families walked, children played, neighbors lingered, and houses faced something better than traffic. Its scale was generous without being empty. The elms made a ceiling. The lawns made a middle ground between public life and private front steps. On warm evenings, the parkway held a kind of urban calm that did not require wealth to enjoy it. By the middle of the 20th century, that calm had acquired a new meaning. Buffalo was still large, but it was no longer swelling with confidence. The population had reached its peak in 1950, when more than 500,000 people lived inside the city limits. After that, the numbers began to thin. Some families moved outward for larger houses, newer schools, garages, lawns, and distance from the smoke and crowding of the old industrial city. Some moved because federal policy, mortgage markets, race, fear, and real estate pressure made suburban space easier for some families to reach than others. The city did not empty evenly. Few cities do. The automobile promised a different geography. It told people they could live farther from work and still remain attached to the old center. It told planners that congestion could be solved by speed. It told politicians that a modern city needed fast roads in and out, roads that could carry commuters from the suburbs to downtown offices, shoppers to department stores, travelers to the airport, and trucks across the metropolitan region without slowing for every corner, stoop, crosswalk, and storefront. The language was efficiency. The result was surgery. The Kensington Expressway, Route 33, cut through Buffalo's east side, replacing Humboldt Parkway with a sunken corridor of concrete, ramps, retaining walls, and exhaust. What had been a green seam became a trench. The parkway's old central ground, where trees once gathered people into shade, was traded for lanes built to move cars quickly between downtown and the airport. Houses that had faced a parkway now faced noise. Cross streets were severed or made awkward. The old east-west fabric of daily life had to negotiate a wound laid north and south through the neighborhood. It was not only land that changed use. Sound changed. The soft ceiling of leaves gave way to the constant rush and hiss of tires below grade. Smell changed. Gasoline and exhaust replaced wet grass and summer soil. Distance changed. A house could still stand across from another house, but the act of reaching it could become longer, stranger, less natural. A child's path to a friend, a church, a store, or a park might now involve bridges, ramps, detours, and the feeling of being asked to cross a thing that was never designed for walking. The old Buffalo had made money because goods stopped there. The new road system was built to prevent stopping. That was the deep reversal. The city had once profited from interruption, from the pause that allowed labor, trade, and exchange to collect along the waterfront. Now its planners sought to eliminate interruption inside the city itself. Stoplights, sidewalks, neighborhood streets, and human crossings became obstacles to movement. The expressway treated the city not as a destination, but as something to pass through efficiently. The Scajaquada Expressway made the contradiction visible in another way. It ran along the northern part of the city, cutting through and beside the landscapes that had been meant to soften urban life. Delaware Park, one of the great works in Buffalo's Olmsted system, found itself divided by fast traffic. Cars moved where the park had once promised removal from the stress of the street. The road connected other roads, linking the Kensington Expressway to the Thruway and the waterfront, but the connection came at a cost that could be measured in broken parkland, noise, danger, and the quiet loss of continuity. A park cut by a highway is still called a park. That is part of the trouble. The name survives, the map remains green, and the damage becomes ordinary through repetition. People learn where not to walk. They learn which side feels easier to reach. They learn to speak over traffic. They learn that a place can be officially preserved and physically diminished at the same time. The wound becomes a route. The route becomes daily life. On the east side, the Kensington Cut entered a neighborhood already caught in the machinery of race and capital. Black families who had moved into and around Hamlin Park were seeking the same middle-class stability earlier residents had sought. Houses, trees, schools, churches, safety, property, respectability. The expressway did not create every inequality that followed, but it hardened them into concrete. It separated neighborhoods by access, exposure, and value. It made the burdens of modernization fall heavily on people with less power to refuse them. No single road destroyed Buffalo. That would be too simple, and Buffalo's story is not simple. The seaway altered freight. Factories aged. Suburbs pulled population and tax base outward. Shopping habits changed. Racial segregation concentrated damage. National policy favored highways over urban repair. Each force had its own timing, its own paperwork, its own defenders. But the roads gave decline a physical form that residents could hear from their porches. They made absence navigable. A family could leave the city and still use it. A commuter could enter in the morning and disappear by evening. A shopper could reach downtown without touching the neighborhoods between. A region could depend on Buffalo's center while avoiding much of Buffalo's life. The expressways made that arrangement feel practical. And practicality can be a quiet kind of abandonment. By the time the old industrial economy weakened further, Buffalo had already been rearranged for a smaller, more divided future. The green connectors were broken. Some neighborhoods were isolated. The city's tax base was under pressure. Houses aged with fewer resources around them. Commercial strips lost foot traffic. Vacant lots began appearing not as dramatic ruins, but as missing teeth in blocks that once held together. At the edge of Lake Erie, the furnaces still burned. South in Lackawanna, steel still gave the region a heavy reason to believe that industry could hold. The blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the union halls, and the pay envelopes all suggested that the city's wounds might remain survivable as long as the great works kept speaking. But roads could not replace work. They could carry men to the plant. They could carry families to the suburbs. They could carry shoppers, commuters, trucks, and airport traffic through the old city at higher speeds than Buffalo's 19th century builders could have imagined. They could not make the furnaces necessary forever. The end did not arrive as silence at first. It arrived as notices, meetings, rumors, lists, union arguments, company statements, newspaper headlines, and men standing in small groups outside gates that had once swallowed them by the thousands. It arrived in the language of capacity, markets, taxes, imports, labor costs, and restructuring. It arrived in words that sounded administrative because no company memo could carry the full weight of a furnace going cold. Then the sound changed. For generations, Lackawanna had lived beside a noise so constant that it became almost private. The blast furnaces breathed through the night. Rail cars clanked along internal tracks. Cranes moved above stockpiles. Steam escaped in white bursts. Trucks passed under the soot-darkened sky. Men learned to sleep through sounds that would have startled strangers awake. Children grew up with the mill not as an object in the distance, but as a presence behind weather, behind dinner, behind Sunday Mass, behind every argument about money. A steel town does not simply hear its mill. It organizes itself around the mill's pulse. In October 1983, Bethlehem Steel ended steelmaking at Lackawanna. About 7,300 well-paying jobs vanished from a city of roughly 21,700 people. That number is worth feeling in scale. It was not one plant closing on the far edge of a large economy. It was a paycheck disappearing from the center of household after household, block after block, parish after parish. It was a mortgage payment, a grocery bill, a school uniform, a bowling night, a union due, a daughter's tuition, a son's apprenticeship, all suddenly tied to a gate that no longer opened the same way. The furnaces had not failed because men had forgotten how to make steel. They failed inside a larger rearrangement. Bethlehem Steel had built newer capacity elsewhere, including Burns Harbor in Indiana. Foreign steel, often cheaper, pressed into the American market. Mini mills took business from older integrated producers. The Lackawanna Works had aging facilities that required heavy investment, and the company argued about taxes, costs, and efficiency. Union leaders argued back, pointing to management decisions, corporate priorities, and the sacrifice of workers who had given their bodies to the place. Each side had its documents. Each side had its injuries. The furnaces went quiet anyway. A blast furnace is not like a storefront that closes at 5 o'clock. It is closer to a contained volcano, a vertical system of ore, coke, limestone, heat, air, timing, and danger. Men do not simply walk away from it without ritual. Steelmaking requires continuation. It dislikes interruption. Once the decision is made to stop, the machinery enters a different kind of life, one that feels almost unnatural. Valves are shut, lines are drained, heat falls. Metal hardens, where motion had been assumed. A plant built for flow becomes a landscape of blocked passages. Outside the gates, the city had to translate that into ordinary days. Ridge Road still had traffic. Churches still open. Bars still turned on their lights in the afternoon. Kitchens still filled with the smell of coffee, onions, frying meat, cigarette smoke, and worry. Children still needed winter coats. The lake still pushed cold air over the slag heaps. Snow still settled against the walls of houses, built for men who had expected to retire with steel pensions. Some did retire. Many did not. Only a fraction of the laid-off workers qualified for pensions. The most wounded were often younger men who had enough years to belong to the plant, but not enough years to be protected by it. They had entered the mill under one promise and left under another. They were too experienced to begin again easily, too young to disappear from the labor force, too old for employers who wanted clean resumes and lower wages. Retraining existed on paper. Jobs existed somewhere. But a man who had earned steel wages could not make a household whole on the kind of work that waited outside the mill's shadow. The wound moved through institutions. The Union Hall, once thick with dues-paying members, lost much of its reason for being. The city government lost revenue from the company that had long carried much of the tax base. Public works jobs were cut. Police and fire departments felt the loss. Houses went up for sale at prices that would have seemed impossible in better years. Families left because leaving was sometimes the last form of responsibility available to them. A city can lose population in the census and still look standing from a distance. That is one of the mercies and cruelties of urban life. The buildings remain longer than the conditions that filled them. The church still has a bell. The tavern still has stools. The porch still faces the street. The school still has doors and windows. But inside those familiar shapes, the human arithmetic changes. A second car disappears from a driveway. A father is home at the wrong hour. A mother takes extra shifts. A son packs for another state. A daughter learns that the old word secure was never as solid as the mill made it sound. For Buffalo, the shutdown was both local and regional. Lackawanna was its own city with its own mayor, wards, streets, churches, and tax bills. But the mill's gravity had always reached beyond municipal lines. Workers came from Buffalo, West Seneca, Blasdell, Hamburg, and neighborhoods farther out, Suppliers, diners, repair shops, banks, landlords, schools, and hospitals felt the change. Western New York did not lose only steel production. It lost one of the great weekly engines by which industrial money moved into ordinary life. The old buffalo had been wounded by roots that bypassed it. Now the industrial buffalo was wounded by capacity that no longer needed it. There is a difference. A route can go around a city and leave its buildings looking puzzled. A mill closure leaves them bereaved. The grain elevators by the river became monuments to an obsolete pause. The steel plant became something harsher, an immense working body with its heat removed. Smokestacks still stood. Rails still crossed the ground. Buildings still filled the lakeshore. But the sound that had explained them was gone. Alicia Patterson reporter John Strohmeyer later described the plant as ghost-like on the shore of Lake Erie. The phrase was almost too exact. The place had not vanished. It had become visible in a worse way. So long as it worked, the mill was difficult to see whole because it was doing too much. Once it stopped, the scale appeared naked. A man could look at the dark buildings, the lifeless stacks, the motionless rails, and understand that the size of the place had become part of the problem. No new business could simply walk in and replace what had left. The plant had been too specific, too large, too tied to a vanished arrangement of ore, fuel, labor, capital, and national demand. Recovery plans could be drawn. Land could be marketed. Buildings could be stripped, sold, scrapped, reused, or left to weather. But nothing could quickly reproduce the old rhythm of wages moving from the mill gate into the city every week. The furnaces had gone quiet. And in the quiet, Buffalo could hear how much of its life had been built around sounds it thought would never stop. By the time the furnaces went quiet, Buffalo had already learned how absence behaves. It does not always announce itself as ruin. Sometimes it arrives as grass between two houses, a driveway leading nowhere, a sidewalk that still bends toward a front door that is gone, a pair of concrete steps facing the street with no house behind them, a maple tree planted by a family whose name has left the block. In winter, snow covers these places gently, making vacancy look almost clean. In spring, weeds return first. The empty lot is one of Buffalo's most honest monuments. It does not belong to the age of the canal, the age of grain, the age of electric towers, or the age of steel. It belongs to what came after all of them, the long work of subtraction. A city that held more than 580,000 people in 1950 now holds less than half that number. The houses did not all empty at once. They aged, lost value, changed hands, fell behind on taxes, burned, were stripped, were condemned, or were taken down by city crews. Between 2001 and 2017 alone, Buffalo demolished more than 5,900 residential buildings. Today, there are around 15,300 vacant lots inside the city. That number should not be left alone. Imagine a house, then remove it. Leave the sidewalk. Leave the curb cut. Leave the basement filled or buried. Leave the next house standing, and the next one gone. Repeat that across block after block until the city begins to look like a sentence with missing words. Nearly half of those vacant lots are owned by the city or related public agencies. Many lie on the east side, where the old wounds of highway construction, segregation, disinvestment, tax foreclosure, and population loss overlap until no single explanation is enough. The land remembers the sequence even when the buildings do not. A vacant lot in Broadway Fillmore may once have held a Polish family near a church, a bakery, a tavern, a corner store, and a factory route. A lot in Genesee, Moselle may carry the outline of a house built for workers when Buffalo still believed in crowding because crowding meant employment. In summer, these lots can smell of cut grass, damp soil, and wild growth. In winter, they become white gaps between dark houses. Children cross them on foot. Neighbors mow them because someone must. Tires leave tracks. Flowers appear in barrels. A hand-painted sign warns against dumping. The city is not dead. That is too easy and too false. Buffalo still has traffic on Main Street, students on campuses, nurses changing shifts, refugees opening shops, families waiting at bus stops in lake-effect snow, bills flags on porches, artists in old industrial rooms, and gardeners working soil where houses once stood. At Canalside, people gather near the restored commercial slip, where the Erie Canal once met the Buffalo River and turned geography into money. The water there has been made public again, edged by walkways, children, concerts, and the careful language of redevelopment. The old canal terminus has become a place to visit. That fact sits quietly beside another. The city once did not need to persuade people to come to the waterfront. The waterfront was the reason they came. Along the Buffalo River, the grain elevators still rise with a different authority. Some remain in industrial use. Others stand in partial afterlife, too massive for nostalgia and too strange for simple reuse. At Silo City, people now come for tours, performances, photographs, weddings, readings, and the echo inside concrete cylinders built to hold grain by the millions of bushels. Voices return from the walls with a delay. Music climbs into spaces once filled by conveyors and dust. The buildings have not been redeemed. They have been interrupted again, this time by curiosity. That is one of modern Buffalo's peculiar gifts. It does not hide its old machinery well. The past is too large. The elevators remain. The rail lines remain. The Olmsted Parks remain, though cut and repaired in pieces. Delaware Avenue still carries houses that remember money. The Martin House, once abandoned, damaged, and partly lost, has been restored with the patience of a city trying to recover one of its clearest acts of confidence. The Buffalo AKG Art Museum has reopened with new glass, new galleries, and public space where another generation can stand under light and mistake for a moment, cultural renewal for a clean break with history. But Buffalo does not offer clean breaks. It offers layers. The city's present prosperity, where it appears, is uneven. A restored house does not fill an empty block across town. A museum expansion does not repair a tax base by itself. A waterfront festival does not bring back a steel paycheck. A kayak passing beneath a grain elevator does not restore the cargo that made the elevator necessary. These things are true at the same time, and Buffalo makes them visible without arranging them into comfort. The empty lots remain the hardest evidence. They are not spectacular like the furnaces, not monumental like the silos, not beautiful like the mansions, not theatrical like the electric tower. They ask less of the eye and more of the memory. Each one is small enough to miss from a car and large enough to change the feeling of a block. Each one carries both damage and possibility without promising either. A garden can grow there. A house can return there. Nothing can happen there for years. In Buffalo, even nothing has a location. Near the end of the story, it is tempting to look for a single image that settles the city into meaning. The restored slip at Canalside, the AKG's new glass, a vacant lot on the east side, the furnaces south of town, the silos beside the river. None is enough alone, so the camera has to move. It begins at the commercial slip, where the old canal water once made Buffalo unavoidable. It follows the river past concrete elevators that taught grain to climb. It passes under the shadows of bridges, toward the lake wind and the industrial ground beyond. Southward, the remains of steel still hold the shoreline in their heavy grip. Eastward, lots open between houses like pauses the city has not filled. Northward, the old mansions sit beneath trees, remembering a version of Buffalo that believed routes, money, and permanence were the same thing. The lake remains at the edge of it all. It keeps touching the city without explanation. In winter, it sends snow over the roofs and vacant land. In summer, it throws light against brick, glass, weeds, water, and concrete. The old routes have changed. The old stops have thinned. But at evening, along the Buffalo River, the silos still catch the last light on their blank walls, and their reflections tremble in the dark water before disappearing under the bridge.